It's time to increase your bankroll by decreasing your daily fantasy sports learning curve. The Curve with Benny Ricciardi and Josh Kalashi starts now.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Curve here at rotocurve.com. My name is Benny Ricciardi. I go by BRich11 on all the daily fantasy sites, and I'm here to walk you through the first part of our show. We're going to start with the recap of yesterday's action, talk a little bit about the weather concerns today, and today's actually a pretty big one with the weather concerns, so it's something you guys should be interested in. We'll move on and talk a little bit about a teaching point today. The teaching point today is the Coors Field effect. So many of you probably already know where we're going to go with this, but we're going to give you our 2 cents on it anyway. Next, we're going to move on to the Vegas lines. Then we're going to talk a little bit about pitching. I'm going to bring in our pitching guru, Josh Kalachi, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the guys that we like today. There's a lot of pitchers on this slate that make a lot of sense to use, and nailing pitching today is definitely going to be something that, it's important every day, but on a day like today where there's so many options, you really want to make sure you got the right guys in there. After that, we'll go on and talk about some of the hitters that we like. And then, as always, Josh and I will finish it up by giving you our cornerstones, the guys that we think you have to have in your lineup and the guys that we think you should be building around today. So that's what we got in store for you. Should be a good show. So let's get started. Before we get started, I'm going to go into a little bit of industry news, something that's been getting kicked around on Twitter and some of the forum posts about multiple entry and guys who, basically have been saying that it's almost unfair that some of these guys with these multiple entries are able to cover all the angles. They're winning all the time. And I have a different view on that because I think that basically anybody can win, whether it's one entry. We've seen some of the biggest tournaments that they've had on DraftKings won by people with single entries, guys who've won hundreds of thousands, maybe even $1 million with a single entry bullet. So I think it's kind of rubbish to think that, you can't win unless you have multiple entries. Does it help you? Yes, it could help, but it helps you because you have more, basically more lineups out there. If you have more lineups, you have more stuff covered. You're going to see yourself up at the top of the leaderboard more often. But it's not about that. It's about making money. It's about who's being profitable. There was a great article put out by a friend of mine named Seth on the Twitter so far this week. I've seen it a couple times. People have been tweeting it and talking about it. Which is why I wanted to mention and give my 2 cents on the subject today. And basically what he said is there was about 40 people who had multi-entered at least 5 entries into the $300 perfect game on DraftKings this week. They had a $95,000 profit between them, all the guys who did have those multi-entries. But it wasn't like every one of them made money, which is the point that I want to throw out there and I want everybody to understand is just because you're making 5 or 10 or 20 or 50 rosters in a day doesn't guarantee you a profit. You still need to have one of those top rosters on a day in order to pay for all the other ones that you had that wound up being losers. I think he said of the 40 people that were in there, less than half of them wound up making a profit over the course of the last 10 days that he tracked, which basically means that, yes, while $95,000 was won amongst that group of 40 people who were putting in multiple entries, one guy might have won 40, another guy won 20, couple guys won 2 or 3 or 4,000 here or there, but there were just as many people who lost a couple $1,000s. There was probably somebody who lost $15,000 or $20,000. Now, again, for people who are playing, for some of the newer players, those numbers might seem, absolutely astounding. And to be honest with you, they are. I mean, I don't play anywhere near that kind of volume, myself. I don't play in those $300 tournaments on a daily basis like a lot of other guys do. But again, it's something that there's higher risk and higher reward. So yes, some of those guys are making a lot more money when they, when they do have the good rosters. But when they don't hit, when they're not on the right stacks, when they're not on the right pitching, these guys are losing $5,000, $10,000. So again, while it might give you more chances and more outlets, more options to make it to the top, it's not a guarantee that you're going to make a profit on it. As a lot of these guys will tell you, you're going to have big swings, especially if you're playing strictly in GPPs, strictly in these big tournaments with these big prize pools. That's why we tell you want to have some cash game exposure, because it helps you smooth out and even out the ups and the downs in this game. and it keeps you in the game long enough until you do hit that big one. If you keep playing, if you can stay consistent, if you can keep yourself above water, eventually you are going to have that roster that pays you $1,000, $2,000, $5,000. You know, if you're playing in the $3, $5, $12, $10, $27 range, you know, you'll eventually have one of those rosters. But if you don't keep yourself in the game long enough to get to that point, so that one day when you do have that perfect roster, you can make a big score, it's not going to matter in the long run. So I know a lot of you have been, you know, looking and reading and talking about this multiple entry GPP stuff, but this is advanced stuff for guys who have much bigger bankrolls than the average player. So if you think that, you know, you're ready to take that next step, fine, try it. You know, there was something a while back that everybody was talking about, the quarter arcade challenge. Use those quarter arcade challenge, take 10 lineups and see how easy it is to, you know, to try to win every night. You know, if it's so easy to throw in 10 lineups and win, then you should be taking down that quarter arcade challenge every day. And it only costs you $2 or $3 to see. You know, multi-entry is tough. If you have multiple lineups, it's also very tough controlling them, you know, making adjustments last minute when stuff happens. And, you know, it's not something that's very easy. So that's my 2 cents on the whole multiple entry argument. There's higher risk. There is higher reward to it. But anybody who thinks that just because you're throwing in 5 or 10 or 15 lineups means you're automatically going to make money, you're automatically going to make a profit, I can tell you for a fact it doesn't work that way. So that's just a little something I wanted to throw out there, my 2 cents on the subject. Now let's get back into what you guys are all here for. And, you know, that's to go over the daily fantasy stuff for today. Before we get into today, we're going to talk a little bit about yesterday. There was a couple things that were interesting yesterday. We had some really, really big pitching performances. In the early slate, you had Jacob deGrom. deGrom went out there and threw a game about 40 DraftKings points. I mean, he was absolutely amazing yesterday. He was one of the top pitchers on the day. He was the guy in the early slate that you really wanted to have on your roster. And he wasn't actually the only guy. If you look at the late slate of games, there was a guy who had 41 DraftKings points through a complete game shutout, and that was Kyle Hendricks. Hendricks was a little bit of a discounted price, but again, if you didn't have this guy on your roster, there was no chance that you were making it to the top of some of these tournaments yesterday. The good thing for us is he was very low owned in 50-50s. He was very low owned in a lot of the cash games. So you didn't run into too many buzzsaws with, you know, guys in your head-to-heads that started Kendrick, or, you know, so many people that had him that if you didn't have him in your 50-50s, you didn't have a chance to cash. But obviously, if you can get 41 points out of a DraftKings performance, I mean, if you got that from a guy who was $12,000, you'd be pretty happy. But to get it from a guy who was in the $7,000, $8,000 range, that's just, you know, phenomenal value that he returned yesterday. The other pitcher who was really good on the late slate was Julio Teheran. He was a guy that we gave you in our value picks for the day. He had a good matchup yesterday and, you know, basically bounced back from a couple poor performances that he had recently. Finished with 31 DraftKings points and, you know, was definitely one of those other guys that you needed. In fact, the winning roster in, you know, in last night's tournaments was a roster that had Hendricks on top along with Teheran as the pairing on DraftKings. I think it was also the winning roster for most of the Qs on Fantasy Aces as well. I think was a pairing of Teheran and Hendricks as well. So those were definitely the 2 guys you wanted in the late slate. In the early slate, Madison Bumgarner and deGrom were probably the 2 guys that you wanted there. Both of them came with scores over 30, you know, got you about 70 points together. Both of those pairings got you about 70 points from your pitching, which, you know, basically takes you almost to the point that we talk about all the time where you need to be to get to that 120 in order to cash in your 50-50s. So either one of those pairings was probably, you know, if you had them, you probably made some money yesterday. As for the bats, Atlanta was the team that cranked out the most runs yesterday. I think they had 10 in that late game. The guys 1 through 4 in their lineup had 4 runs scored, 7 RBIs, and a stolen base. So if you were playing on FanDuel and you stacked those 4 guys, or if you were playing on DraftKings and included those guys in your stack, you probably had a pretty good day. I think the 5th or 6th batter for Atlanta was Christian Bethancourt, and he also had like 17 or 18 DraftKings points as well. So obviously the Atlanta stack was well represented on the top of some of these tournaments yesterday. Cubs got home runs out of Addison Russell and Chris Bryant, 2 guys that they just called up. Both of those guys were pretty evenly owned across the board in a lot of tournaments. A lot of people were on Bryant. That matchup against Odrismir Despaigne. Definitely not a good hitter's park, but again, we were on Brian as well. Third base was not a very stacked position yesterday, so having a guy like Brian definitely helped you out if you did have him in your rosters. The Mets stack was the one that won early. Lucas Duda hit 2 more home runs. A couple other guys chipped in with anywhere between 8 to 12 to 14 points. They were the ones that got a lot of rosters up to the top in the early slate. Especially if you had the Mets with DeGrom as your pitcher. DeGrom and Lucas Duda basically by themselves could have got you, pretty close to the cash line in most of your 50-50. So that was the way you wanted to play the early slate yesterday. But let's move on now. Let's talk about today's slate. And while we talk about today's slate, the first thing we're going to talk about is weather. There's only one game with a weather concern, but as I mentioned in the opener, it's a big one to worry about because there's a 94% chance of rain in Colorado today for that Colorado-San Francisco game. Now, this brings us to one of the teaching points that Josh and I wanted to talk about today. How do you handle a game in Coors Field when you have 2 bad pitchers going up on the mound? Now, let's face it, Kyle Kendrick is quite possibly the worst pitcher in Major League Baseball right now. Right-handers hit him, left-handers hit him. They hit him for average. They hit him for power. There's basically it doesn't matter who's batting up against this guy. It's a good matchup. Everybody, that basically means with Kyle Kendrick on the mound today, everybody in the Giants is in play. Now, on the opposite side, we have Ryan Vogelsong, who you guys know I talked about how he gives up home runs. I called him Vogel Dong, and then he went out and made me look good by giving up 4 home runs in one game to the LA Dodgers about 2 weeks ago. One of the problems that Vogelsong has is that he does get touched up for home runs, especially by left-handed batters. But, I mean, even right-handed batters in a good hitter's park like Coors Field, are going to be able to take him yard. So what Josh and I wanted to do is just kind of give you guys a little bit of an idea on how to handle a night like tonight. I know Eric, one of our viewers who's always joining us in chat here, was talking today about, how do you play on a slate tonight like this, where that's going to be such a big situation, where there's going to be so many guys from that game that are just going to stack it. I mean, there are going to be 20+% ownership on basically everybody in that Rockies and Giants game. So I'm going to let Josh talk a little bit about it first, and then I'm going to come in. So Josh, how are you handling the fact that we have a game in Coors Field tonight with 2 gas cans on the mound that everybody pretty much expects to see a lot of runs out of?
It's going to be an interesting time because I think when you look at games like this, I think the over/under, if it's not 10, it's 10.5 now. Like you just said, with Kendrick and Vogelsong on the mound, it's projected to see a high amount of runs. And some things that a lot of people always talk about is not stacking in cash games and use 50-50s in these head-to-heads. But I think tonight you're going to see, like you said, a ton of Rockies, a ton of Giants, and it might skew the line a little bit because if that game is a high-scoring game, it's just a 7-4 or 8-5 game, those cash lines are going to be at 110 to 120 minimum on DraftKings and probably around 35 or 40 on FanDuel. But if that game is low-scoring, we're talking about a low-scoring night when you see these guys winning tournaments with 135, 140, and these 50-50, especially in single-entry lines, probably being around 85 or 90 on DraftKings, and on FanDuel probably about 28 to 30. And I think the way that I would target it is I think you always have to throw in a full lineup from that game into a tournament. Like you're looking at maybe a $1 solo shot entry or a $3 moonshot entry with some Giants bats, with some Rockies bats, maybe putting a few of each on either side, like putting in Tulo and Arenado, Angel Pagan, Hunter Pence, and then filling up the rest of the roster with some other pitchers. But for me, I can't exactly target it in tournaments because so many people will have it. So I will just probably have that one single bullet that you talked about with maybe a top 4 Rockies stack or a top 4 Giants stack, maybe a little bit of both. But for me, for 50-50s and head-to-heads, I think you have to target 1 or 2 guys in that game because of the high run total and the ability that they can hit the ball out of the ballpark. And obviously that park factor is a big deal, but I wouldn't be suggesting to use 3 or 4 guys from that game because it's just like any other game. But if it busts, it's a lot lower. Now, that being said, we talk about in 50-50s and head-to-heads, there is a term called blocking, where a lot of people will probably have guys like Arenado tonight. A lot of guys will have Charlie Blackmon. And in head-to-heads, I think it's a bit different than 50-50s because a lot of people in these head-to-heads will have Rockies bats. A lot of people will have Giants bats. So if you're looking at head-to-heads, you might want to use a little bit of a different lineup than 50-50s. So it's amazing that how one game at Coors Field with two bad pitchers changes the whole slate, but it's crazy because it does happen. Now, that's a weather concern for today. So if that game's canceled, it throws everything off, especially a lot of those people that will make their lineups the night before or this morning and not have time at work or throughout the day to change their lineups. So I hate to say you're rooting for a game to be canceled because it's going to be a ton of offense to be seen, but be sure to keep that in mind because if that's the case, that changes the whole slate. It makes everything a little bit more interesting. It changes the pitching because you won't be able to afford all those bats if you're picking some of the top pitchers, which we'll get to in a little bit. Guys like Scherzer, guys like Felix Hernandez. You can't necessarily stack a game in Coors Field for that reason because the prices are fluctuating. So for me personally, I probably will only have one or two guys in my 50-50s and head-to-heads from that game. I'm going to probably make one lineup for stacking it, but I hate to say it, but I will probably be avoiding that game for the most part in my 50-50s. But head-to-heads is a little bit of a different story. What are you doing?
Yeah, we bring up a couple good points there. First off, for everybody too, this is Memorial Day weekend, so today is one of the biggest travel days of the year. So there's probably a lot of people who throw in some rosters and are heading to the beach or heading to somebody's house for a barbecue or something. So Josh hit it right on the head. There's going to be a lot of dead lineups, especially if you're playing over on FanDuel where, you know, guys aren't going to have a chance to late swap out if something does happen with the weather there. But, you know, this is one of the things. And here's why I really kind of think that it's a little bit different this year than it has been in years past. If you look at the, you know, obviously we've all talked about the fact that there's a Coors Field premium. Whenever there's a game in Coors now, the sites are jacking up the prices on these guys. So like Josh was mentioning, you can't stack them. You know, you can't stack this entire team and just throw it into a tournament and, you know, still have any kind of decent pitching. And tonight is a night where there's a lot of really good pitching and, you know, you're going to be looking for some value bets. But, you know, as we do, we usually talk a lot more about cash games. So 50-50s, head-to-heads, things like that. I definitely think if this game is going off, you have to have some exposure to it. I think there's a couple guys that you want to make sure you put in your lineup because it is the highest scoring game on the day. It is two really bad pitchers, and nobody would be surprised if either one of these teams put up 10 runs. Now, I'm not going to break any of my rules and go and put 3 or 4 bats in a cash game from this game just because it's a good game. There's still a lot of other guys in really good spots today. There's still a lot of other guys who I want to put in my lineup that I think can also have big games. But again, you can't not have exposure to this game. There are going to be people who stack it and put it into 50-50s. There are going to be people who stack it and play head-to-heads. But you know what? That's not the optimal strategy, as we've talked with you guys before. There is always a chance. I mean, the Rockies had a couple games last week in Colorado where they only put up 2 or 3 runs. So it's not like it's an automatic slam dunk. They're going to put up 10 or 12 runs on both sides of this game. But at the same point in time, you know, if somebody does have a lot of Rockies exposure or a lot of Giants exposure in their lineup and you don't have any, it could wind up hurting you. So you definitely want to make sure you use a couple guys from this game. Again, this is the only one with any weather concerns today. So keep an eye on the weather, see how that works out. And, you know, just be ready if you're playing on DraftKings, be ready to swerve off to other guys because it will be a very highly owned and highly used game. And just make sure you have a backup plan because you don't want to be the guy who's scrambling with, you know, no idea last minute if they do decide to cancel it. But anyway, that's our teaching point for the day. We wanted to talk a little bit about how to handle that game because we know we've been getting a lot of questions about it and people have been concerned about it. You know, again, like I said in the forum chat yesterday, if you're really concerned about it, make the team that you would normally make and then hedge yourself by throwing a $3 moonshot entry in with, you know, a stack of bats on either side of that game that you like and the best pitching that you can fit in. And, you know, basically just hope that while everybody else is going to have the same stack, you're basically hoping that your pitching and the other guys that you can put in there are going to outscore them. And, you know, this way, if that game does wind up 14-12 or something crazy like that, you know, you're at least going to cash a little bit in that, you know, in that one tournament. So we're going to move on now, talk about the Vegas lines, get into some more of today's stuff. There is one game with the least runs expected that really stands out to me, and that is the San Diego LA Dodger game. Game is taking place in Dodger Stadium, features a matchup between Greinke and Cashner. Andrew Cashner's been solid. Greinke's been very good. It's only a 6.5 run expected total in that one. So you got to think that both of those guys are in play. Greinke is probably more in play. He's the favorite in this one, but his strikeouts have been down a little. So we'll get into that a little bit when we talk about some of the pitchers that we like today. There are 4 other games that have run totals of 7. Philly and Washington. That's a matchup between Scherzer and O'Sullivan. And again, like we talk about with the lines, not all lines are created equal. Scherzer is probably only expected, he's a minus 300 favorite, which we'll talk about. He's probably only expected to give up 1 or 2 runs in this. Sean O'Sullivan is a little bit of a gas can, so the other 4 or 5 runs to get them to 7 in this game, Vegas basically expects to come from Washington scoring them against O'Sullivan. So while there are other games with 7-run totals too, it doesn't mean that all these pitchers are expected to give up the same. And Scherzer is easily the one guy who, is expected to dominate today. The Mets and Pittsburgh game, that features another good pitching matchup. You got young Noah Syndergaard, the Norse god of strikeouts, against Garrett Cole, who's a very underrated talent who's starting to shine through right now. Both of these guys are highly touted prospects. They're, both been up in the majors for a short amount of time. And both guys have already pretty much put their stamp on this league. I mean, these are 2 guys that we expect to see towards the top of rotations for years to come. So that's another really good matchup. I can see why it's only 7 points there. And that's in Pittsburgh as well, another pitcher's park. That's why the spread is so low. Oakland-Tampa Bay game is a matchup between Kazmir and Archer. I think this one could go over a little bit. Both of these guys are very good pitchers, but they're also prone to blow-ups from time to time. I couldn't tell you which one of them is going to have the blow-up, but I definitely think that one or the other could wind up giving up some runs. And then the last low-total game is Cincy and Cleveland. That's a matchup between Mike Link and Carlos Carrasco. Again, Carrasco's been striking out guys left and right, has a lot of that strikeout upside, so he's somebody that's interesting to me, definitely for tournaments and maybe even for cash today, which we'll get into in a little bit. As for the high-run games, as we talked about, San Francisco, Colorado is head and shoulders above everything else. It's 10 runs in some spots, 10.5 already in some other spots. 2 bad pitchers, Coors Field. Basically, like we said, it's one of those games where you're going to need at least some exposure to, because it could be the highest scoring on a day, and it could actually get really, really ugly. There's 4 other games where they're expecting 8 runs. Chicago Cubs and Arizona, Cole Mentor-Lester matchup. Most of that they're expecting to come from Cole Mentor's side. Houston and Detroit, McHugh and Simon. That one's pretty even. That's basically a pick 'em, so they're expecting about 4 or 5 runs from each team in that one. The Angels and Boston, that's a pretty good pitching matchup. You got Garrett Richards, who's been very good, and Rick Porcello, who's been pretty solid. Porcello's not much of a fantasy pitcher. He's not a big strikeout guy. Richards is more of that big strikeout guy. But again, that's another game they're expecting some runs out of. Got to think that some of those are going to come from the Boston side, because the LA bats have really been struggling. They haven't been doing anything, basically. So you got to think that, basically Boston's going to get to Richards, but that's not going to be easy as well, because Richards has been pretty good this year. So that game might even come in under. And then the last one is Minnesota and the Chicago White Sox. You got a matchup between Phil Hughes and Jeff Samardzija. Expecting 8 runs in that one. Samardzija is a slight favorite. Hughes obviously been home run prone throughout his career, but he hasn't been horrible this year either. So those are 2 decent pitchers that you got going up in that one. As for the biggest favorites on the mound, you got Max Scherzer's minus 300. Greinke's minus 185. Michael Pineda's minus 175. Carrasco in that Cincinnati game, minus 155. Cole over the Mets over Syndergaard at minus 150. I was a little bit surprised he was that big a favorite. And then the biggest stud, who's the smallest favorite on the day, is Felix Hernandez, who's only minus 145. So that's just a rundown of the Vegas line, some of the things that we saw, we wanted to mention to you guys. I want to start talking about pitching. As I said, there's a lot of good pitchers on the mound today, a lot of ways you can go, a lot of guys that make sense. For me, even though Philly is not a big strikeout team, I love Max Scherzer today. I think he is by far and away the best value on the board. I think he's got the best upside today on the board. And I don't even care that he's the highest priced pitcher on the board, because you're basically taking one of the best right-handed pitchers in the league, giving him a matchup with one of the teams who struggles the most against right-handed pitching, and you're doing it in a good pitcher's park. I mean, you really couldn't ask for a better situation than the situation that Scherzer is in today. Now, if you're playing in cash games, to me, he's the play. I see him on a bad game still getting 25, maybe even 30 DraftKings points. On a good game, I think he could go 9 innings, get a complete game shutout today, and, wind up around 35, 40 DraftKings points. So to have that kind of upside and that kind of a floor on a guy, I don't mind paying up a little bit for him, especially because I think a lot of other people aren't going to. Now, I don't hate the matchups for a lot of the other guys that are up towards the top. Guys like Greinke, guys like Felix, but I'm really struggling today to figure out who my SP2 is. You have a guy like Greinke who his price is up and his strikeouts are down, so that doesn't really make a lot of sense. You got a guy like Felix Hernandez going up against Toronto. He's even pricier than Greinke is. Toronto has some big bats. They hit him around well towards the end of last season. They got the Felix Hernandez in his last start against them. They have a lot of right-handed bats, which is something that Felix usually does pretty well with. But again, that's a really good hitter's park. I just don't know if he has the same kind of upside that Scherzer has today in a much better matchup. You got Garrett Richards, who has a 2.29 ERA right now and a WHIP of only 1.02. So, he's been about as good as anybody in the league right now, so you can't really knock him. Pineda, who just got shelled in his last outing, but before that, he had 4 straight starts of 46, 30, 15, and 30 DraftKings points. So he's basically averaging 30 points per start on DraftKings over his last 4 before the last game where he got shelled and had a negative number. So he's been kind of consistent except for that last outing, and he's been putting up really big numbers. So he's another guy that you got to consider and keep in the mix there. Lance Lynn has 27, 30, 10, and 27 DraftKings points in his last 4 games. So he's been, absolutely lights out as well. He's going about 6.5 innings a game, getting about 8 Ks. Those are elite level kind of numbers. I never used to think of Lance Lynn as a guy who was up towards, the top of the pitching charts, but the way he's been performing so far this year, you really can't argue with him. There's still another 4 or 5 guys that you can look at. I didn't even talk about Garrett Cole. We didn't talk about John Lester. We didn't talk about Samardzija. We didn't talk about Carrasco, about Wood, about Syndergaard. The Andrew Kashner. There's a good 10 or 11 pitchers that make sense on the day today. So obviously, I'm going to need some help getting through this. I'm going to bring in our pitching guru, Josh Kalachi, see what kind of stuff he's been able to dig up and see if he's going to be able to, make a little more sense out of all of this for us. So, Josh, you want to, try to help me figure out who my SP2 is tonight?
Yeah, I was just looking at the lines, what you were just talking about with the fact that Scherzer is a 300 favorite. That's insane. That's almost one of those things. If you're in Vegas and you're betting, it's almost not worth picking. That's how much of a favorite he is. Is that the highest that you've seen in a long time?
Kershaw was the other day. Kershaw was up there, but yeah, you rarely see a line that gets over 300. You rarely see a line that gets over 240, 250. Usually guys that are like really, really big favorites will be somewhere in the 220 to 240 range. 300, they're basically giving him. They're giving him like a 75%, 80% chance of winning this game. So that's, it's pretty significant.
Yeah, for sure. And that brings us to the next point that I wanted to talk about is today I love a ton of pitchers, and I think a lot of people do. But what I'm going to do is break down a few that maybe a couple of my favorites, maybe not a lot of people are talking about. I don't have to mention Scherzer and Hernandez because they're just the 2 best pitchers on the slate. By now, you guys understand that they're pretty much good options in nearly any matchup, and both of them actually do have good matchups today, regardless of the Phillies' inability to strike out. And the Felix actually faces Toronto, but Toronto is somebody that usually you would be afraid of in terms of offense, but they've struggled a bit this year, especially with all those injuries to Reyes, and Joey Bats isn't 100% either. So both of them are good options. I will have a lot of them, but a lot of people will as well. So I want to talk about some other pitchers today because I feel like a lot of you guys know more about Felix and Scherzer, but we're here to kind of detail a little bit more of the other guys that could potentially help you win some money today. The first guy I want to talk about is Michael Pineda against the Rangers. The Rangers are hitting just 227. They have a low slugging percentage and a very high K rate against righties. And that's something I want to target with Pineda because he does strike out a lot of hitters. He's a heavy favorite today on the game that just about 7.5 runs scored. So he's projected to get a win, which is big on FanDuel and on DraftKings as well. But the one issue with Pineda was his last start. I believe he only had 1 strikeout. He didn't have a great performance, but it was against Kansas City. You have to look at that. Kansas City has one of the lower strikeout rates in baseball, and I think they strike out the least amount of times against right-handed pitching. So it's definitely something to take a look at when you're looking at these guys, looking at research, and it's one of the reasons why I still am on Pineda today, because he does have that ability to strike out a lot of guys, and against the Rangers, you do strike out a lot. I think we could see a higher total. His stuff has been insane this year, leading to his high strikeout rate. He throws 3 pitches: fastball, curveball, or fastball, slider, and a changeup. The fastball and a slider is what he uses most of the time. But one of the main reasons why I like him and why he's been so effective is because he throws from, it's called a 3/4 delivery, which it's not necessarily right over the top and it's not sidearm, but it's right in between. And that's given him the ability to get a lot of movement on his fastball. You saw him when he had that 16 strikeout game. He was throwing that fastball that starts at about a hitter's just below his shoulder, but it's moving down, it's moving into a righty, it's moving away from a lefty, and it's got a little bit of run on that fastball as well, and it can jump into the mid-90s when he really throws it. So it gives him the ability to use that one pitch to get a lot of outs and strike a lot of guys out. And if they are on that fastball, he can throw that slider that's just dropping off the table right now. The next pitcher I want to talk about is Zach Greinke against the Padres. Benny mentioned him earlier. Their strikeouts are down a little bit, but I still excuse me, I still like him today because he's facing the Padres, who are hitting 244 against excuse me, need some water or something. The Padres hitting just 244, but Will Myers is on the disabled list, so that means that in that 244. Part of it is because the fact that Myers has been able to hit well this season. With him out of the lineup, that brings him to below 240, which you guys read in my piece about those thresholds. That's my threshold for opposing hitters against certain pitchers. So one of the reasons why I like him why I like Greinke is because Myers is out. That Padres lineup struggles a bit against righties, and Greinke has actually been one of the more consistent pitchers in baseball this season. He has 5 strikeouts and 7 straight starts, and he's been working deeper into games, which has been an issue with Greinke in the past. He's always had good stuff. He's always been able to throw 4 or 5 pitches however he wants to, but he hasn't been able to get to the 6th or 7th or the 7th or 8th inning because he works a lot of 3-ball counts. And he said that in interviews. He said that he likes to work around hitters and throw a whole bunch of different stuff at them because the end result of the at-bat is all that matters, and he's right. But the problem is MLB bullpens can be taxed in a 162-game season, and that's why he's working deeper into games so far this year. And it's really paying off in terms of fantasy because he has, I believe, every start this year is over 15 DraftKings points, and I believe over his lowest is 9 on FanDuel. And that's an excellent mark in 50-50s and head-to-heads because when a guy has a high floor, it makes for an excellent pick and a good matchup, and that's exactly what Greinke has today against the Padres. The last guy I want to talk about for 50-50s and head-to-heads is Noah Syndergaard. Now, this is his 3rd start, and you guys have heard me talk about him all 3 times. I can't be more of a fan of this guy, and for obvious reasons. He has an excellent fastball, a great slider. He can strike out a lot of hitters. And he faces the Pirates today, who strike out among the most in baseball against righties and then lefties. They have a right-handed heavy lineup, which – it's good for Syndergaard because that slider he has really breaks far away from right-handed hitters, and that's what we see from guys like Andrew McCutchen, Starling Marte, and Neil Walker, who doesn't hit as well against all-speed pitches, and that's something that Syndergaard can use to keep him off balance. So be sure to take a look at him. He didn't reach all of the thresholds from my research this morning, but there are some times where you got to look a little bit beyond the numbers and check and see if a guy has a great matchup in the gist of things, and that's exactly why I like him today. He has that strikeout upside, and he's been a very good pitcher so far this year in 2 starts. Now, one thing to look at with younger pitchers, and this is something to target, is when young guys come up to the major leagues, if they have a lot of talent, they're usually successful for 5 or 6 starts before the opposing major league teams get the tape on him, and they're able to watch how his release points are, what he does, see if he's tipping his pitches. For the first few starts, with a guy that has great stuff, it's hard for opposing hitters to figure him out, and that's one of the reasons why I've been targeting Syndergaard, and we'll be looking at him again today. And another thing with him is if you use him in your 50-50s head-to-heads, he's a lot cheaper than a Scherzer. He's cheaper than a Hernandez. He's cheaper than guys like Garrett Cole and the other pitcher I just mentioned, Michael Pineda. So if you use him, you have room for some of those Rockies bats that we talked about. You have room for some of those big bats like a Mike Trout possibly. But if you have those 2 high-priced pitchers, you're not going to be able to fit them. So keep that in mind when constructing your lineups because if you want to use a cheaper pitcher in your 50-50s and head-to-heads, I think you should go with a guy like Syndergaard. There are three pitchers that I'm targeting today in tournaments only for one reason or another. I don't want to mention them right now. Alex Wood against the Brewers. Wood is the only left-handed pitcher today who checks all the boxes for me. We talk about what that means is the Brewers aren't hitting well against lefties this year. They're hitting just 201. They have a 25.3% K rate, which is, I believe, the tops in baseball against lefties besides the Pirates. And one thing with Wood is he struggled to strike some batters out in the past few starts, but you have to look into it. I looked at his game log, and his strikeouts have been down because in the last few games he's faced teams that haven't struck out a lot. Guys with their teams with K rates underneath of 20%, he's only struck out 0, 1, 4, and 1 batters. Now, in those other 3 starts against teams that have struck out a lot more, he struck out 7 guys, 9, and 7 again. So that's something to take a look at, because if a guy in a matchup is striking out more hitters, that's what we're targeting in fantasy baseball, and that's the reason why I'm using him in tournaments today. One reason why I can't use him in 50-50s and head-to-heads, though, he faces that Brewers lineup that has been hitting righties lately. And just like some Brewers fans have said, especially the Eric in our chat, a reader and a big Brewers fan, you never know when they're going to hit. But they do have those talented right-handed hitters with Carlos Gomez, with Ryan Braun, with Aramis Ramirez, and they can hit left-handed pitching at any time. And that's the reason why I'm not entirely comfortable with him in 50-50s and head-to-heads, but I'm definitely going to take a shot with him in tournaments today with that matchup, with his ability to strike out opposing teams that don't fare well against making contact. The second pitcher I want to mention for tournaments is Ubaldo Jimenez. The Marlins are hitting just 252 against righties, which is a lot higher than a lot of other teams. But think about why. D. Gordon's batting average is well over 400, and I think it's close to 450 against right-handed pitching. So that could really skew that batting average against. If you take that out, that's a lot of hits that could potentially be below 240, which is one of the thresholds we talk about to target in opposing offenses. If you look at the rest of their numbers, they're slugging just 350, which is not a very good number against right-handed pitching, and they're striking out about 21% of the time. Now, Jimenez has been really good so far this season, allowing more than just 3 earned runs one time, and he's struck out almost a batter per inning. The reason why he's doing so is because he's been throwing his fastball a lot more this season. And if you look at Jimenez in the past, he's been a guy that either walks 6 guys or strikeouts 10 guys. He's been back and forth. And part of the reason has been his control on it. He lacks command on his secondary pitches. But since he's thrown his fastball a lot more this year, I think it's close to 65% of the time, he's able to work ahead of batters rather than coming from behind. And that gives him the ability to strike out a lot more hitters because he does have good stuff. One other reason why I like him is because he's an American League pitcher pitching in a National League park today. And that's something to always keep an eye on because he's facing 1 less hitter and, in my opinion, 2 less hitters because you don't have to pitch to the guy in front of the pitcher with usually a weak hitter right on deck. The last pitcher I want to talk about is probably the most intriguing guy for me today, and that's Alfredo Simon for the Tigers. Now, Simone on FanDuel is priced about $7,700. I haven't seen his price on Aces yet, but I think it's right in the middle of the road as well. But on DraftKings, he's just $5,500, which is way too cheap for him. There will be a piece up on RotoCurve right after the show about about some value plays, and I detailed him more into like I kind of let on more reasons why I like him. And that's one of the reasons why I'm targeting him simply on DraftKings because of his price. Faces the Astros, who, as you guys know, have yielded a lot of fantasy points to pitchers at given times. But they can hit the ball out of the ballpark a lot, and that's one reason why I can't use him in my 50-50s or head-to-heads because that Astros lineup can go off at any time. He does face them who does have a high strikeout rate. I think it's over 25% against right-handed pitching or right-handed hitters. Right-handed pitching for Simone. And that's one of the things why I want to target this in tournaments because you're looking for high strikeout guys. And Simone hasn't been that guy in his career, but he is now as he's throwing that split-finger fastball I talked about 2 weeks ago. Now, it's a little bit misleading because when you hear fastball, you're thinking he's throwing that ball hard, but his split finger is not very quick. He's only throwing 81 miles an hour. But the reason why it makes a big difference today because the Astros have a lot of right-handed hitters, and the split-finger fastball drops off the table. He's thrown it about 33% of the time, which is absurd for a breaking pitch, but it gives him the ability to get a lot of ground balls and strike a lot of hitters out. You look at some Astros have some free swingers like Evan Gattis. They also have some guys that have been watching a lot of pitches as well, like George Springer has walked a lot this year. His batting average about 200, but he's getting on base at about a 330 clip. But that's one thing to look at because the split finger fastball, does look like it's going to be in the zone, and it falls off the table, and that leads to a lot of strikeout. And that's why Simone has been effective this year. So it's one reason why I am targeting him against a strikeout-prone offense in the Houston Astros. There's two other pitchers I do like, but I'm just going to mention them quickly. That's Rick Porcello and Jeff Samardzija. But I don't like them as much as the other guys, and I don't think they're worth taking risks on today simply because of the other pitching we look at. Every time we have a show, I mention one guy to stay away from. And today, it's not necessarily about one guy. It's about getting too cute with pitching. There's too many good options today to go after guys like Chris Young or Josh Colmenter. Some people will try to put in a really cheap pitcher just to be a little bit different and go against the grain. But there's no reason to do that with all the good pitching today. You can spend on Scherzer, you can spend on Felix. Or I just mentioned some cheap options you can put in your lineups as well. There's no need to go after a cheap pitcher and try to win the tournament based on just spending on huge bats. You can fit some really good pitching in for not as much money. So don't get too cute with pitching and stay with the guys you like. That brings us to the end of our pitching segment. Benny, do you have anything to add?
No, I just want to kind of build on that last point that Josh was saying. There are so many good pitchers on the mound today that there's going to be 2 or 3 or maybe even 5 guys who put up 25, 30 points. So, like Josh was mentioning, yeah, you could probably go and spend min price on a guy like Chris Young, and maybe he gets you 18 points for, 3 or 4 points per $1,000 of cost. But it's not going to be enough if you got guys that are putting up 25, 30, maybe even 40 points on a day like today. There are so many good pitchers up towards the top, so many good guys and good matchups that you just want to look at all the good options that you have today and try to pick 2 of the best of those good options at a reasonable price. Because if you're looking for some of these guys down at the bottom, I mean, even on his best game, you're probably not gonna get a 30-point outing out of a Chris Young. It's just not something that he is capable of doing at this point. He was basically a relief pitcher who they stretched out. He's only been going like 5 or 6 innings. He doesn't have the kind of upside for a tournament that a lot of these guys have, and he doesn't have the kind of safety that a lot of these other guys have if you're playing in your cash games. It's just, it doesn't make sense. It's okay to go cute and get some of those cheap pitchers if it's a night where, it's a short slate, like maybe you were playing Thursday afternoon or Thursday night and you didn't like some of the options up top. You thought they were too overpriced. Fine, that's when you go and reach on that. But on a full 15-game slate like tonight, where you have, 7 or 8 or 9 guys who are ace-type quality and have, SP1 kind of stuff, you're basically fading 7 or 8 of those guys if you're taking a cheap option. When you're doing it on a short slate, when there's only 6 games or 10 or 12 pitching options, you might only be fading 1 or 2 high-priced options if you're taking a cheap guy. But on a day like today, you're basically hoping that 7 or 8 of these guys blow up and that you're able to get, good amount of points from your cheap option. And it's just not something that, usually pays off for you in the long run. So I agree completely with what Josh said. There's a lot of mid-range options that are good, good situations today. If you're trying to save, you don't want to use the Scherzers, you don't want to use the Greinke's, you don't want to use the Felix Hernandez's. There's a lot of guys in that 7 to 9K price range that make a lot of sense. You don't need to go dumpster diving on a day like today. So that's basically our thoughts on pitching. Hopefully that narrows some of the thoughts down for you guys. We're going to move on and talk a little bit about our hitters right now and then get into our cornerstones. So we're going to start at catcher. And again, I mean, you're going to see it throughout the analysis. San Francisco-Colorado game is going to play a big part of tonight's slate. My top catcher on the day, even though he's a little pricey, is going to be Buster Posey. Kyle Kendrick, he stinks against righties. He stinks against lefties. It's a great hitter's park right there for Posey. Posey's hitting 3rd in that order now. He's got Hunter Pence back, so Pence is in the cleanup spot, so he's got a little bit of lineup protection. The guys in front of him, he's got Angel Pagan leading off. They get on base. Posey's been hitting. Posey has 96 DraftKings points in his last 8 games, so he's been averaging 12 points per game. Like we said, for your cash games, you want 8 to 12 points out of every guy on your roster. That'll get you to, the 120 mark that you need if you get the 40 or 50 that you want out of your pitching. And, Posey's been one of the better bats at a catcher position for a couple years now. And for me, he's the top option today on the day. If you need to save money and you want to go cheap, I also like the spot that AJ Pierzynski's in. He gets a matchup with Willie Peralta. Peralta really struggles with left-handed bats, especially left-handed bats that have a little bit of pop. Now, Pierzynski isn't on fire like he had been a couple weeks back. He was the 4th batter in that lineup. He's now dropped down to like 5th or 6th. But again, he's still, as far as catchers go, he's still one of the catchers who has a decent RBI spot in the lineup. There are very few catchers you find that bat in the top 5 of the lineup. So sixth is pretty good as far as the catcher position goes for lineup placement. Pierzynski doesn't have a ton of upside, although he does have some home run power. But even without that, he's been averaging he's had at least 2.25 FanDuel points in 3 of his last 4 games. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but he's only 2,400 on FanDuel. So he's giving you basically returning value for you. He had a couple games where he got up into the 3.25, 3.5 range. And, if he does something like that for you at that price, you're going to be very happy with it. So if you need to save money, I think Pierzynski is a good option. You can also look at a guy like Miguel Montero, lefty going up against a right-handed pitcher. He's another one, should be batting 5th or 6th in that order. So those are some of the cheap options you can go with. But if you can figure out a way to do it, again, if that game doesn't get rained out, Buster Posey is easily in the best spot for catchers today, and he does have the most upside. Plus, he's been the most consistent lately. So he's definitely somebody you should try to work into your rosters, and it'll give you a little bit of exposure to that game by, basically using the 3-hitter. His price, the other thing I like about him, even on DraftKings, while everybody's price is up, his price didn't jump as much as some of the other guys did. You have a guy like Brandon Crawford, who's almost $5,000 today as the shortstop for the Giants. And, you can still get Posey at a somewhat reasonable rate pretty much on all the sites. He's gone up because of the Coors premium, but he hasn't seen a huge $1,000, $1,500 jump like some of these other guys have. Moving on to first base, staying with the same game. I really like Brandon Belt. Belt is a left-handed batter going up against Kendrick. Kendrick has allowed a 309 batting average and a 197 whip so far this year to left-handed batters. Last year, he gave a 290 batting average and a 149 whip to lefties. So basically, this guy struggles real big time with left-handed bats. Brandon Belt has been hot since coming back. He's got 90 DraftKings points in his last 5 games, which means he's averaging about 18 DraftKings points a game. That is ridiculous. That is just amazing, production out of him. He usually bats about 5th in that lineup. He's hitting behind Posey and Pence. Again, Coors Field, he does have the Coors Field premium on him. He's almost $5,000 as a first baseman today. And it's very tough for me to pay up $5,000 for Brandon Belt, even in a good matchup, because you can get other guys, and the Anthony Rizzos of the world and other guys, who are studs at that same position for even cheaper today. Abreu's $300 or $400 cheaper than he is. And as much as I like Belt and as much as I like the matchup, on DraftKings, I wouldn't do it. If you can find him cheaper on some of the other sites that you're playing on where it's a little more reasonable, I definitely think he is in a good spot. I definitely think he has a good matchup, and I definitely think he's been hot. So he makes a lot of sense. But on DraftKings, I just think he's too expensive. And the reason why I think he's too expensive is you can have a guy like Freddie Freeman today. Freeman goes up against Peralta, we just talked about, struggles with left-handed bats with power. He's the guy for the Braves that hits in the 3-hole, provides them a little bit of pop, drives in some runs, has a high on-base percentage, and he's only $4,000 on DraftKings today. So, excuse me, this hat's got a little bit of an itch on the inside. He's basically, Freeman's been a guy who's been mashing, and he's only $4,000. Now, he hasn't been mashing as much lately. He's basically been putting up a couple decent games, threw up a few a few zeros recently. But if you can get Freeman for $4,000, or you can pay almost $5,000 for Brandon Belt, and they both have good matchups, they're both in good spots, I just don't see how I can pay another $1,000 for Belt when I can have a guy like Freeman who's in just as good a matchup, maybe not as good a hitter's park, but has just as good a chance, if not a better chance, for a home run and a big upside game today, and I could save $1,000 on him. If you want to save even more, there's another guy in that San Francisco and Colorado game that I think makes a little bit of sense, and that's rookie Ben Paulson. Now, we didn't do a rookie prospect watch for him, but basically he came up 3 games ago. He's a left-handed batter. So far, he's 4 for 8 in his quick stint up here in the majors. He's batting 5th in that order for the Rockies right now. Gets to go up against Ryan Vogelsong. As we mentioned, Vogelsong is a 287 batting average with a 142 whip against them last year from left-handed batters. In 2015 so far, he's given up a 323 batting average with a 191 whip to left-handed batters. So the way you really want to go after a guy like Vogelsong is with these lefties. And again, Paulson's been as hot as anybody since he got called up. He's hit 4 for 8. He has a hit in all 3 games that he's appeared in so far. and he's going to be hitting fifth in that order. So he's in a good spot to drive in runs. He's got a good chance to go yard today. He's got some power. He's got a nice swing. He's a big prospect. You know, there's a lot of boxes that he checks off. He's only 2,600 over on FanDuel. He's 3,300 over on DraftKings. And if you guys haven't realized, I'm giving you a lot of these cheap value options today, because if you want to pay up for a guy like Felix or a guy like Scherzer or a guy like Greinke, you know, we're not going to be able to go studs at every position. So that's why we were saying earlier, you know, yeah, it might sound great to say, oh, let's stack all the San Francisco Giants against, you know, a guy like Kendrick, but just stacking, you know, guys like Posey and Belt is going to cost you almost 10K on DraftKings today. Over on FanDuel, it's going to cost you, you know, 7 or 8 or 9K. So you're talking about giving up, you know, a big portion, maybe 18 to 20% of your salary, just putting in those two guys on your lineup. So if you think you're going to get a big, you know, a big stack of Giants bats using the top 4 or 5 guys, you know, you're not going to leave yourself any money for any kind of pitching that you're going to be able to live with. So just keep that in mind. Like I said, that's one of the reasons why I'm happy that they put this little Coors Field premium on there, because it's no longer just there's a game of Coors, let's just stack everybody in Coors and win all the money. It's not going to work out that way for you this year like it did in years past. So let's move on now. Let's go to second base. There are 2 guys I like at second base. And I actually started my research on FanDuel today as opposed to DraftKings, where I usually do. And this is something that was interesting to me. Now, I have heard a lot of people say that Robinson Cano is no longer a daily fantasy play. You know, playing in that park in Seattle, his home runs are down. The guy's still a solid hitter. He's still a very good player. But there's no upside with him lately. If you use him, you're just getting burned. So I'm looking and I'm doing my research. And the first second baseman that I wound up on is a guy named Jace Peterson. Now, if you don't know, Jace Peterson's the second baseman for the Atlanta Braves. He's a left-handed batter, so he gets that same lefty matchup against Peralta that we had been talking about. And he's been hitting atop that Braves order right now. So he's the Braves' new leadoff man at the moment. Basically, he's been on fire in his last couple games. Let's see here. Let me get the numbers for you. He has 59 DraftKings points in his last 5 games. So he's been averaging about 12 points per game, and he's very cheap. So you're going to get the discount by using him. He's in the lefty-righty matchup with Peralta, so he's got the good splits that we're looking for. And, you know, again, at 3,300 on DraftKings, 2,800 on FanDuel, he's very cheap and he makes for a great option. But here's where I brought up Robinson Cano, and the reason for it is, while I was on FanDuel looking at Jace Peterson and you know, thinking that he was the guy I was going to talk about and write up today, I noticed that Robinson Cano was 2,900 on FanDuel, so only $100 more. And I'm saying to myself, okay, as much as I like Peterson and as much as Peterson's in a good spot, I mean, this is quite arguably the best hitting second baseman in the league right now. And I'm getting him at about the 11th or 12th most expensive second baseman on the day here today. Now, again, I understand that Robinson Cano hadn't been returning value. He hasn't been great. But I think his price has finally reached a point where he is now back in play as a fantasy option. At 2,900, he really doesn't need to do a whole ton today in order to pay that off. And again, he's still hitting third in that order. So he's in a good RBI spot. He's in a good spot in the lineup to score runs. He still is a very good hitter. He's a very professional hitter. Even if he's not hitting home runs, he's picking up some singles. He's picking up some doubles. He's getting on base. You know, one of the problems he has is the guys in front of him aren't getting on base enough. So he hasn't been driving in runs. But again, he has a matchup today. He gets Marco Estrada. Estrada is a guy who gives up a lot of home runs. They're playing the game up in Toronto in the Rogers Center, which is a park that gives up a lot of home runs. And the one thing Estrada does struggle with is left-handed bats. So you basically have everything all together to give Cano a lot of upside today. And in a situation where Cano has a lot of upside and his price is really cheap, well, that makes him a guy that you can put back and play. Now, I know that a lot of people don't like playing Cano. I know a lot of people haven't been playing him lately. But this guy is just too good and has you know, too much of a track record to dismiss him when you're looking at a guy like a Jace Peterson who's been hot and makes a lot of sense today. But for $100 more, if I could have one of the best hitters at the position, you know, I think that Robinson Cano is definitely somebody you got to consider and then put into some of your lineups in a good matchup today like this. Moving on from second base, we're going to go to third base. One of the guys who I like and who you guys have heard me mention a lot is Jimmy Paredes. And I think he's still in a good spot here today. His price has come up everywhere. And remember, he's second base eligible on FanDuel. He's only third base eligible over on DraftKings. But basically, he's hitting second in that order right now. He's behind Machado, who's actually another guy at third base that I like. You can go either way there, and you're not going to get an argument from me. But I chose Paredes because Paredes is a left-handed. Well, he's a switch hitter, but he'll be batting left-handed today against Henderson Alvarez. Alvarez, in 17 innings pitched since he's come back this year, has given up 22 hits and 12 runs to left-handed batters. Basically, Paredes has 80 DraftKings points in his last 10 games, and he's been pretty consistent, 5, 7, 12, 10, right around that mark. So he's averaging that 8 points that we said that we need out of a guy in order to make him a good cash game play for us. And in a matchup like this against a guy who's really been struggling, I even think he has some tournament upside as well. On DraftKings, again, his price is a little expensive, but, he's a lefty bat going up against a righty pitcher who struggles. He's in a pretty decent hitter's park today. Actually, they're in Miami today, so not a great hitter's park today. But again, he's got a good matchup against a pitcher who's been struggling, and I definitely think that he's a guy who could be in play. The other third baseman I'm using, basically the same argument that I just made for Robinson Cano, is Kyle Seager. Goes up against Estrada. Estrada struggles with left-handed bats. He struggles with left-handed bats with power, and this game is being played in the Rogers Center. So Seager's a guy that I think is going to have some upside today. I also think with the way Estrada gives up home runs, he's going to be trying to pitch around a guy like Nelson Cruz. So I expect Seager to get up with a couple guys on base, pretty often today. And he is that guy who can get a hold of one. His batting average right now is only about 250, which is well below his career averages. But he has been hot lately. He has a hit in about 7 straight games. I think he has 10 hits in his last 28 at-bats or something along those lines. So he is starting to heat up. He's in a good matchup, and he's another guy who I think has a lot of upside today. I also think that he's going to be safe for cash games as well. I'm not sure if I would use him over Paredes. I think Paredes is a little bit more consistent. But again, Seager is a little bit cheaper. So if you're looking to save some money today, I think Seager's another guy that you can look at. Moving on to shortstop today, I'm going to give you my play of the day today. And my play of the day happens to be at shortstop. Doesn't matter what site you're playing on. Doesn't matter who else is there. There's only one guy that I'm using, and that one guy is Ian Desmond. Desmond has basically been on fire lately. They moved him up to the 2-hole in that order, so he's hitting behind Span and right now in front of Yunel Escobar, who's their third batter, which doesn't sound like a lot, but Escobar's been hitting very well, very good as well. And obviously Bryce Harper in the 4-hole has been just a machine basically lately. But we got 26.5 points in his last 5 games out of Ian Desmond on FanDuel. So that means he's averaging about 5.5 FanDuel points per game for you. And his price is only $3,100. He's $4,400 on DraftKings, which is a little bit more expensive. And he's only $4,500 on Aces, which is a great price. So if you're playing on FanDuel, you're playing on Aces, you plug him in right away. For me, I've even been plugging him in on DraftKings right away because there's really not a lot I love at shortstop today. Hanley Ramirez is not hitting well. Tulowitzki is not hitting well. And then everybody else that you go down to underneath there, they're slap hitters, they're single hitters. Desmond's one of the few guys who has home run upside. He also has the upside for multiple hits, extra base hits, and he's got guys behind him who can drive him in. And with a guy like Span who gets on base so much, steals bases, goes first to third, takes that extra base, he's going to be in a position to drive in some runs today as well. So for me, Desmond is an automatic play. Excuse me. Using him in cash, I'm using him in GPPs. I'm basically using him all over. He's my play of the day today at shortstop and one of my top plays today, period. So that brings us to the last part, and that's outfield. There's a couple guys that I wanted to discuss. Obviously, Denard Span is one of them. I don't know what else I can say about this guy. He basically is averaging about 4.1 FanDuel points in his last 8 games. Every game, he's 2.5, 4, 5, 3, 2, 5.5. So he's getting you pretty solid, consistent production. He's a guy that you can definitely use in your cash games. On FanDuel, I wouldn't really use him in my tournament plays because he doesn't have huge upside. He's not a home run hitter. He's not a guy who's going to get you 4 or 5 RBIs, but he's a very, very solid player. Top of that order for them in a good matchup today. Definitely think he's a good guy that you can include in cash, but I don't know if I would use him for tournaments. One guy who I like for cash and tournaments is Nick Markakis. And you might be wondering why, but Markakis is no longer hitting leadoff. When he was in the leadoff spot, he didn't get any RBI opportunities. Yeah, he scored a couple runs. He got a couple hits. He's a good left-handed bat that hits for average. He doesn't really have power, even though he's hitting in the 4-hole. He's not a guy who's going to be a home run hitter, but he's hitting behind Freddie Freeman, who's a high on base percentage guy. There's a couple other guys in front of him like Maben and Jace Peterson, who have been playing well and getting on base. And his price is very cheap. He's $2,500 on FanDuel. He's $3,200 on DraftKings. He's $4,600 on Aces. You're going to be hard pressed to find another cleanup hitter that you can have in your lineup for that cheap. And again, he's got a decent matchup today. He goes up against Willie Peralta. Peralta struggles with those left-handers, struggles with the long ball. So there is a lot of upside to using a guy like Markakis today. And again, at the price that he's at today, I mean, on FanDuel, if he hits an RBI double for you, he basically pays off his salary. At his price on DraftKings, if he hits an RBI double, pretty much the same thing. You need a little bit more out of him on Aces, but still, I think he's a guy who's in line for multiple hits today, and he's got a lot of upside. So he's definitely somebody that you want to, you want to take a look at that price, because it'll help you fit in some of those big ticket pitchers that we said you should have today. The last guy I wanted to mention is Hunter Pence. Now, Hunter Pence to me is going to be a sneaky play tonight. Although that game's in Coors, he has pretty much just come back from injury. He's only been around for a few games, so some people might not be on him. They might even not know that he's back in that lineup. He's hitting cleanup at the moment. He's hitting behind Buster Posey, and he faces one of the worst pitchers on the slate today in Kyle Kendrick. He's in one of the best hitters' parks today in Coors Field. He's got the right matchup. He should be, with a guy like Kendrick who gives up a lot of base runners, he should have guys on base in front of him. Gives him a chance to drive in some runs. He has a chance to hit a home run. He can steal a base for you. He can pick up multiple hits. I mean, Pence just has a lot of ways to score. I like him best on FanDuel, where his price is only $3,300. Over on DraftKings, he is one of the most expensive options on the day, and that's something that I wanted to talk about. You have him at $5,500 over on DraftKings, which is the same price as Bryce Harper, same price as Nelson Cruz, who's playing in a home run park in Toronto against the home run pitcher against Estrada. It's even the same price as, you have a guy like Charlie Blackmon, whose price is starting to creep up there as well. Blackman's got Vogelsong, Vogeldong, however you want to talk about it. Vogelsong's given up over 300, over a 160 whip in the last 2 years combined to left-handed bats. So, there are other guys at that price range who I think I would rather have on DraftKings. But if you're playing over on FanDuel for only $3,300, I think Pence makes a really nice play for you. So that basically breaks down all the hitters that we wanted to talk about today. We're coming up on that 1 o'clock hour. So, Josh, do you want to come back on here and give the people some of the cornerstones that you're building your lineup around today? Some of the guys you think that you actually absolutely have to have?
Yeah, I think today is a day that you're going to have to pay up for pitching. I like a lot of those guys, so I'm going to have a few different lineups for tournament games. But in my 50-50s, I'd like to have Scherzer and Felix, but I just can't. I don't know if I can pay that much and just not have enough room for hitters in a game that it looks like, or in a slate, it looks like a lot of hitters can put up a lot of fantasy points. So I'll probably be moving down. I have one of Scherzer or Felix, but I'll probably be having a lot of Pineda as my second starting pitcher, and possibly even a Syndergaard. In order to do that, though, I'm going to have to need some cheap bats. And Ben Paulson, if he starts and plays first base, if he bats in the top 5, he's going to be one of the guys I'm building around at his cheap price. So if that Colorado game and Giants game is on at Coors Field, I'm going to have some exposure to that game. But if it's canceled, I think it's going to be a big benefit for a lot of people that have been looking elsewhere in their 50-50s and head-to-heads. So for me today, I'm going to have one of Scherzer and Felix, and then Pineda is my second pitcher. But after that, I'm going to have to find some cheap bats. What are you doing, Benny?
Yeah, I'm not really happy about tonight's slate. I think you're going to have to pay up for pitching. I agree with Josh there. And I think that because you're paying up for pitching, there's going to be a lot of people looking for value on the bats. And there are only so many bats that you can get that are good value. A lot of the guys that we mentioned, there's a few others that we didn't mention that'll be in play as well. But what I feel like tends to happen on a night like that is that everybody kind of gravitates to the same bats. So, like Josh just mentioned Paulson, I mentioned them in my analysis. I think a guy like Paulson is going to be really, really highly owned tonight because he is in a good spot and he is really cheap. And, he just makes a lot of sense. There's going to be some other guys in the same boat, guys that we mentioned like Przinsky, some of the outfielders that are a little bit cheap like Markakis. Like, I think these guys are just going to be so highly owned tonight because in order to fit those pitchers, you really need these cheap bats. And again, there's limited options with these cheap bats. I think that it doesn't change the way I'm going to go about it for my cash games. I still think you need Scherzer. I think I'm going to come down below like the Greinke and Felix level. Probably looking more in like the 8K kind of range for my SP2. There's a whole bunch of guys that are interesting around there. Guys basically from Syndergaard and above. Below Greinke, above Syndergaard. I think there's a good 5 or 6 guys there that I might want to use. When lineups come out later, it's going to sway my decision. If there are, any weak lineups that have a lot of guys sitting today, that'll definitely push me onto some of these pitchers one way or another, because I'm pretty indifferent to a lot of these guys right now. I like them all. I don't love any of them. So we'll be somewhere in that range. As for bats, though, like I said, Ian Desmond is one of those guys I want on almost all my teams today. I think he's the best at that shortstop position. If that Colorado-San Francisco game goes, I'm going to try to fit in Buster Posey because I think he's head and shoulders above everybody else at his position. But basically at every other position on the board, I think there are expensive options and cheap options that are available. The only 2 places where I don't want to spend down are shortstop and catcher. So I might try to do the opposite of what everybody else usually does. And, most people usually punt the catcher, second base, and shortstop position. So I'm thinking the way I'm going to try to differentiate myself is to pay up at catcher and shortstop today and go with a lot of the value guys that we mentioned that those other positions cost. Today is a day where there's a lot of value guys that you can get at those positions. And worst case scenario, hopefully my pitching and those, that guys like Desmond and Posey, who I did pay up for, can outscore the people that, other people take at those positions. But, that's basically the way I'm going to go. Like I said, I'm probably going to be playing lighter volume tonight than I usually do because I'm not really in love with the slate, to be honest.
Yeah, just one quick note I wanted to mention is I think if that game at Coors is played, a lot of people will be having those bats. And I actually think that that's going to bring some of their own percentages on Scherzer and Felix down a little bit. So if that game plays, be sure to keep it in mind that a lot of those high-priced pitchers may not be as highly owned as you think. So take advantage of that in your 50-50s and your head-to-heads. But that brings us to the end of the show. We will see you on Tuesday, May 26th, I believe it is. You can find us on RotoCurve in the chat, in the forums. Be sure to post a note there. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. Find us on Twitter at BennyR11 and at Josh Kalachi. For Benny Ricciardi, I'm Josh Kalachi. This has been The Curve. Benny, you have anything else to add?
Nope. Just stay classy, DFS, and good luck tonight, guys. Enjoy your holiday weekend.